Welcome. Good evening. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of myself, former Congressman Mel Levine, and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. That is our America at a Crossroads leadership team. A special welcome back to tonight's esteemed guest, election law scholar Rick Hasen from UCLA Law. We are so grateful to you for joining us, and what a revealing and exciting week this has been. How auspicious that tonight's speaker is an expert who can provide analysis both about what happened this week in elections, as well as looking forward to next year's midterms and the related challenges and opportunities those midterms present. Thank you so much for responding to our audience. Thank you so much for responding to our solicitation for donations. We really appreciate the generosity of our America at a Crossroads community. If you have not had a chance yet to donate, there's always an opportunity. There's a donation link in every email, but we just really want to thank you and tell you how much we appreciate you as an audience. You're really remarkable. Next week on November 12th at 5 p.m. Pacific time, we will welcome a new guest to us. His name is Stephen Cash. He's formerly of the CIA and the Department of Homeland Security, and he's currently executive director of an organization called the Steady State, which is a nonprofit which is comprised of former senior national security officials drawn from across intelligence, diplomatic, Homeland Security, and defense communities. I think there's 300 or 400 former officials who are in this organization, and he can speak on their behalf. The topic is the rise of authoritarianism in America, the perspective from former national security professionals. It is sure to be a very interesting and revealing program. You can register for all of our November and December programs in the email you'll get after tonight's program. Now, without further ado, please welcome tonight's outstanding moderator, Larry Mantle. He is a superstar broadcast journalist who is the longest running talk show in all of radio. I'm sure of that. For 40 years, Larry has hosted Air Talk, a daily talk show on our local NPR, which is now known as LAist. Larry is as knowledgeable about sports as he is about international finance, and his show covers every imaginable topic, and he does so with intelligence and heart. And we really appreciate Larry Mantle. He's a vital member of our America at a Crossroads team. Larry, the show is yours.
Janice, thank you so much. I so appreciate your kind words, and it's always a thrill for me to be a part of America at a Crossroads. Thank you, Mel, as well, and Zev, who I just spent considerable time with Monday as we covered live the Dodgers victory parade through downtown Los Angeles and then the celebration at Dodger Stadium. And Zev was an integral part of that, talking about the importance of the Dodgers to Los Angeles culture and community, as well as what happens on the field. I so appreciate that. This evening, of course, our focus on a very different kind of contest. As you likely know, yesterday's elections produced across-the-board victories for Democrats in the most closely contested races. Here in California, Proposition 50 easily prevailed, with hundreds of people standing in line to vote even after 8 p.m., when we all knew that 50 had passed by that point. So I guess these are voters who felt so strongly they wanted to be on the record as supporting it, or else they didn't get the notifications on their phones. Regardless, we're going to examine the national results from yesterday. We'll look ahead to next year's midterms with UCLA professor of law and political science, Richard L. Hasen. He's written prolifically on election law and our state-run election systems. His most recent book, which he actually debuted with us on America to Crossroads, A Real Right to Vote, How a Constitutional Amendment Can Safeguard American Democracy. I've enjoyed talking with Professor Hasen many times over the years about topics of election law and political science. Professor Hasen, so great to have you back with us on America to Crossroads.
Well, it's so great to be with you, and thanks to Mel and Zev and Janice for having me back. It's good timing with this one election behind us, and of course, I and everyone else has already turned our focus to 2026 when the control of Congress can be on the line.
I just want to invite our viewers to please submit questions. As Janice was just mentioning, you can do that in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And if you're so inclined, we'd love to see your first name as well as the community that you're asking your question from. It's nice to get a sense of all the different locations that are viewing us throughout the English-speaking world and beyond. So, Rick, let's first employ your political scientist cap here. The resounding Democratic gubernatorial victories in Virginia and New Jersey, coupled with Prop 50's turnout, the margin of victory in California, it leads to the easy analysis that this is a repudiation of President Trump and his administration. But what's the story beyond that that you see in these results nationwide?
Well, I mean, the first thing to note is if we start here at home with Proposition 50, the idea that you could get Californians who resoundingly approved nonpartisan redistricting commissions as recently as 2008 and 2010 to approve a Democratic partisan gerrymander. That's exactly what they were trying to get rid of voters when they decided to take politics out of the redistricting process. The idea that voters would, on such a large margin, pass Proposition 50, I think has to be understood as a response to Donald Trump. If you looked at the ads that were being run on TV, it was all kind of a referendum on Trump. Tom Steyer, who's maybe a gubernatorial hopeful, running ads like with a fake Donald Trump, and like the ad literally ended, "Stick it to Trump." And I think that was really notable that Democrats want to play hardball now. They see Republicans engaged in gerrymandering in places like Texas, and this had to go before the voters for reasons having to do with California law. But the voters were on board. It wasn't just the legislators. And then if we zoom out, yeah, it's true. It's possible to think of all of this as kind of a repudiation of Trump, but also the economy is faltering. We're in the middle of a shutdown. Just before we came on, I saw a story that about 10% of flights might be cut out of major airports tomorrow. So it's not just Trump directly, it's what's happening with tariffs, it's happening with the economy. And so it's not surprising. I think that I saw Nate Cohn, who actually of the New York Times, the Tilt newsletter, talking about how what was really surprising was the margins, and that just as polling in Trump years, when Trump's on the ballot, seems to understate Trump support, in midterm election years, it seems to understate the amount of Democratic turnout. So it used to be that Republicans turned out more in midterm elections. They were like the older, better educated, more established people with a long history of voting. A lot of those people have now moved to the Democratic Party, and now they're voting for Democrats and against Trump.
Professor, what about President Trump's analysis that the reason that Republicans fared so poorly was largely because of the shutdown? Republicans have been blamed for that. Is that a significant piece of what we saw?
You know, I haven't seen any detailed polling on that, but certainly, if you look at what the headlines are in the news, besides the air traffic controller issues, you have issues related to SNAP. And, besides the shutdown, I think what's happening in major U.S. cities with ICE, I think these things, the public doesn't necessarily approve of Trump's agenda. That you can see when Donald Trump was elected the second time, it was following a pattern around the country of the repudiation of those who were in office during COVID, and Biden presided over part of that period, a real anti-incumbent mood around the world. So there's a lot of factors. It's really hard to say which one is the most important. But this is kind of a bad omen for Republicans as they look forward to 2026. And I think that's actually important in thinking, as I'm sure we're going to talk about, the extent to which there might be more redistricting shenanigans coming from states in upcoming months.
So Proposition 50, as you mentioned, enacts a Democratic gerrymandering of California House districts in response to the Republican gerrymandering in Texas. It launched a kind of an arms race of redistricting across the country. And so a number of analysts have said, by the time all the dust is settled on this, it's going to advantage Republicans because Democratic states beforehand were typically more gerrymandered than Republican states just to start. And so there's more Republican seats to pick up if everybody does this. And that, that this may have started with what happened with Trump pushing Texas to do it, but the Democrats lose. Now, do you think that there may be a Democratic wave in the midterms that sort of overcomes that, or do you take issue with that narrative that Republicans end up with more gerrymandered seats at the end of the day?
Well, you're right that there's more opportunities for Republicans to gerrymander, in part because there are more states where Republicans control all the levers of government, or in a place like North Carolina, which has a Democratic governor, their state law says that only the legislature, that called the General Assembly there, gets to draw the district lines. And they went from North Carolina's a kind of a 50-50 state, Democratic Republican. They had a 10-4 congressional district, 10 Republicans to 4 Democrats, and now they've made it or tried to make it 11-3. So I don't think that this Prop 50 is the last shoe to drop. There are still other states that are being pushed to district. But what I thought was interesting is the large amount of pushback that's coming from some Republicans. So Trump and Vance have been leaning on Indiana Republicans to get rid of a district. So far, to no avail. In Kansas, just yesterday, the Republican legislature was basically giving up on trying to come up with a new plan to get around a Democratic governor. So there are all kinds of pushes. In the end, if Texas and California cancel out each other, it could be that overall Republicans net 7 or 8 seats that they otherwise couldn't have gotten. Now, the margin in the House is very, very small, but we've seen wave elections as many as 40 seats or more changing from one party to the other. The other thing is, if you are a Republican, you wake up today and you're being asked to redistrict to make your district less safe to try and create another Republican seat in the state, well, that could be dangerous because, a Trump +5 district, where the Trump won by 5 points, that's not really safe for Republicans now if there's a wave election. And so that may put some brakes on things. So I think in the end, most analyses I've seen say that if we see the states we expect to see, maybe Illinois, maybe Maryland, maybe Florida do this, there could be some gains for Republicans, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be enough to keep control of the House in Republican hands.
Well, and especially as you're saying, typically midterms benefit the party that's out of the White House, and that, of course, is Democrats in 2026. I want to go back to Proposition 50 because technically, under the measure, the citizen independent redistricting would return with the data from the 2030 census. But I just wonder, short of a national movement to create independent redistricting across the country, would Democrats, who will presumably still be in the majority 5 years from now, would they support going back to independent citizens redistricting, or will they look to pass another measure just like 50 that would extend the partisan gerrymandering further? I wonder if the days of independent citizen redistricting are gone, not just for 5 years, but well beyond that.
Well, I think in answering that, let's talk about how we got here. How we got here is that in 2019, the United States Supreme Court said, we're not going to police partisan gerrymandering as violating the Constitution. And that was kind of like a off to the races moment for states to engage in more partisan gerrymandering. Before that, it was unclear if there were limits on partisan gerrymandering. So a race to the bottom for sure. And the initiative, the 2 initiatives that were passed in California, not only applied to Congress but to the state legislature. That part has not been put on hold, so we still have independent redistricting for that. But if the situation remains the same, would Democrats try and put another measure on the ballot if they could to try to maybe extend it? I think that's definitely possible. The solution here is going to have to come from Congress. So in the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 4, it says that Congress can make or alter any state rules related to congressional elections. This is the reason already why every district that's for Congress has to be a single member district. We can't have larger districts that elect multiple members, something that some people have advocated as an election reform. Can't do that because Congress passed a statute saying you can't do that. Congress passed a statute banning partisan gerrymandering, requiring the use of commissions. And you're seeing some of the Republican members of Congress who are being gerrymandered out of their seats, all of a sudden now wanting to join with Democrats in passing national redistricting reform. I don't think that's going to happen with a Republican House. There aren't enough Republicans. I don't think it's going to happen when Donald Trump is president. But if Democrats take back control of both houses of Congress and the presidency in 2028, going into 2029, the big question is going to be, are Democrats going to blow up the filibuster for election reform? That's something I've advocated for a long time. I wrote about that back in 2018 when Democrats actually had the chance to pass something like the For the People Act, and they didn't because Joe Manchin and Senator Sinema and a few
Kristen
were
Sinema.
not willing
Yeah.
to do that.
Yeah. Let's talk about the lawsuit that's been filed by the California Republican Party against Proposition 50, citing two constitutional amendments that the plaintiffs claim are violated with Proposition 50. Take those one by one, please, Professor.
So, Proposition 50 itself is not being challenged in this lawsuit. There was a lawsuit before the election that argued Proposition 50 couldn't go on the ballot because of problems under state law. That went all the way to the California Supreme Court, and the California Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to take this case. And so that seems to be dead. The challenge now that was filed in federal court by Republicans today is not to Proposition 50 itself. It's to the maps that Proposition 50 pointed to that were enacted by the legislature. Now, we talked about how partisan gerrymandering doesn't violate the Constitution, or at least can't be policed in federal court. But racial gerrymandering can. And the main argument that's made in this lawsuit is that this is a racial gerrymander. And that's kind of a term of art. Let me explain what it means. It's a little bit complicated, but it's worth understanding what the Republicans are arguing here. So the Supreme Court has said that when you draw district lines, you cannot make race the predominant factor, the most important thing that you do when you draw your district lines, subsuming political considerations, traditional districting principles. And if you make race the predominant factor, it's got to be justified by a compelling interest, like maybe compliance with the Voting Rights Act. So the Republicans are arguing that Paul Mitchell, the person who helped to draw these lines for the legislature, that he put Latino representation first and foremost. It was a racial gerrymander. It subsumed these other considerations. That's going to be a really hard argument to make when this was a partisan gerrymander. Everybody knows this was Democrats stick it to Trump, all of that stuff. People knew this was a partisan issue. And so to say that race predominated, going to be a very hard case to make on these facts. If it does, get that far, then the question would be, can the Voting Rights Act justify the consideration of race? And if you would ask someone like Paul Mitchell, why is he mentioning, as in the lead up to Proposition 50, that the maps protect Latino voting rights? It's because Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act requires California to do that. And so it's going to be a hard argument to make. It could be affected by the Supreme Court's ruling that we're expecting at some point in a case out of Louisiana. We can get into that if you want, but it's going to be a hard argument to make just because that evidence is not there. The other argument is it was intentional discrimination against Latinos that it barely got a mention that violates the 15th Amendment. I don't think they're going to end up having anything serious to say about that. But there's one other really important point to note here, which is the timing point. The plaintiffs, the Republicans, in their lawsuit, they want to get a court moving really quickly and issue a preliminary injunction. That requires holding a hearing, having evidence. This is usually a many, many months process. And the Supreme Court has said, even in the context of redistricting, that federal courts should not be changing the rules as we get closer to an election. And the courts actually applied this rule called the Purcell Principle against both Louisiana and Alabama redistricting plans that were challenged as being illegal. And the Supreme Court said, no, this is coming too soon before the election. So even if Republicans have a meritorious claim, there's a decent chance that it's not going to be adjudicated in time for 2026 and would only apply if there were some change in the maps to 2028 and 2030.
Is Purcell, does it have some sort of time definite link to it, or what's too close to the election? How's that defined?
Well, I'm a big critic of the Purcell principle. I actually named the Purcell principle from a case called Purcell versus Gonzalez. It's not that principled as a principle. So the court has been inconsistent. It has applied this rule when the election was many months away. I think in the Alabama case, it was 9 months away. So we don't know what that period is. Initially, it was like The original Purcell case was out of Arizona, and it was weeks before an election. The question was about applying a voter ID law. That's when the court said there could be a lot of voter confusion, but the court has kind of extended this rule both temporally to longer time periods and to redistricting. So it's going to be, if the Supreme Court is consistent, they might say to a court that might want to put the maps on hold if they think the Republicans have a good chance, well, it's too soon, too close to the election, you got to wait for 2028. But more likely, that district court, it's probably going to be a three-judge district court. It takes months for these cases to get going. And so by the time the court rules, maybe we're in April or May, and already, primaries are happening. People are running for office already. I saw that two Republican incumbents have announced they're going to run against each other, Young Kim and Ken Calvert in the same district. So with all that reliance interest, I'm skeptical that the timing could work to actually have a challenge to the Prop 50 enacted lines in time for the next election.
Rick, back to the claim about using race as the principal factor for this redistricting that is implemented with 50. Is it implied or stated that the Latino identification of the voter is a proxy for being Democrat? Or what? I'm trying to understand exactly how that's being linked, given that partisanship, the Supreme Court is not recognizing as a reason for it to jump in.
Larry, that's such a great question. And it shows you why this whole idea of racial gerrymandering makes no sense in places where partisanship and race overlap. So the big case that the Supreme Court's considering now out of Louisiana drew a second congressional district because they were told they were likely in violation of the Voting Rights Act by not creating a second black opportunity district for Congress. And the question the Supreme Court was addressing was, is race or party the most important thing here? How can you answer that question when 90% of black voters in Louisiana vote for Democrats and about 2/3 of white voters in Louisiana vote for Republicans? But the Supreme Court has said this is what you've got to do. You've got to figure out if race or partisanship predominates. So one way you might do that is ask, do whites and blacks in Louisiana vote for different candidates in a Democratic primary, right? So that would take the issue of partisanship out of it. And so they try and look at that kind of evidence. Or could you draw a district that could be just as much of a partisan gerrymander that wouldn't, say, separate voters on the basis of race as much? So it's this weird kind of exercise that the Supreme Court has required jurisdictions to go through. And part of the reason for it is that some states were using Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which requires being race conscious and requires drawing some of these districts, as an excuse to draw lots of these districts, sometimes in odd shapes, and sometimes to accomplish all of these odd political goals. And the Supreme Court wanted to put a stop to that. And so in the Louisiana case, there's this tension between what the Voting Rights Act says, which is you've got to be race conscious, and the racial gerrymandering constitutional claim, which is don't make race the most important thing. And so we don't know. The court may end up even striking down or limiting part of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which could have implications for this Prop 50 lawsuit, although, again, probably not in time for 2026.
Well, if that provision of the Voting Rights Act stands, though, it sounds like then that calls on federal courts to have to parse what is being race conscious, but not making it the principal factor in how you do redistricting. That's pretty significant hair splitting.
Courts have been doing that for about 25 years, and I speak to the federal judges that have to do it, and they know that it is not an easy job. And these cases, many of them are three-judge courts, and that means you don't go to the Ninth Circuit. You don't go to the Fifth Circuit. It goes directly to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court has already heard 4 cases involving the question, is it race or party that predominates? I mean, it's absurd, but this is the standard. And yet they won't police partisan gerrymandering. So if you don't like partisan gerrymandering, like Republicans in California don't like partisan gerrymandering, or you're a Democrat in Louisiana, you don't like the Republican partisan gerrymander, that district was drawn to actually help Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, you claim it's a racial gerrymander because the courthouse door is open to that claim, but not open to a claim that taking partisanship into account is too much. And you get these weird things where people in North Carolina stand up and say, we're not looking at race data. We're trying to stick it to Democrats. We are engaged, literally the head of the General Assembly in North Carolina in the Rucho case, the case that said they're not going to police us. He said, I think good public policy is electing Republicans and not Democrats. I'm trying to draw lines to maximize the number of maximize the number of Republican seats. And he said, the reason I didn't draw an 11th out of 14 district for Republicans, I couldn't figure out how to do it. That's a defense to the law as opposed to an indictment of the whole process. So really, Congress has to step in and provide some sanity for this whole
what is the status, Rick? What's the status of lawsuits against Texas's Republican gerrymandering?
So Texas passed a plan in 2021 that was challenged as a racial gerrymander and an intentional racial discrimination claim in there under the 15th Amendment and a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. That preliminary injunction ruling we were awaiting that, like taking place over a number of years. And then the plaintiffs came in and they amended their complaint and they've now asked for a new preliminary injunction to stop the Texas maps from the new Texas maps that were passed this summer from being put into place. We're waiting for a court ruling. So it could be that some of those 5 Republican districts will be rolled back by a lower court. And if they do, the Supreme Court might say, no, don't roll them back, or it's too late to do it this election. We just don't know. This is really hard for campaigns, for candidates. They don't know what district they're supposed to run in. It's hard to fundraise when you don't know where you're running, who your constituents are going to be. It's just a mess. And it's going to be a mess. In Missouri, where they've enacted another redistricting plan, voters are trying to collect signatures to create a referendum. If the referendum qualifies for the ballot, it just means you get enough signatures so that voters vote on the law to decide if the law should stand. The law's put on hold. So if they get enough signatures, then the Missouri one is put on hold. I mean, it's just everywhere that this is happening, there are lawsuits. California is no different than these other states in that regard.
And just to clarify, Professor, so in Texas, that is a race-based lawsuit. They're saying that Latino voters in Texas have been discriminated against?
Well, they're making 3 claims. One is that Latinos and Black voters have been intentionally discriminated against in violation of the 15th Amendment. Another claim is that Latinos and Blacks have been discriminated against in terms of a discriminatory effect in violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and the racial gerrymandering claim, like we see in California. Race was the most important factor that the Texas legislature used when they were deciding to draw lines. Why might they look at where the Blacks live in parts of, Dallas or Houston? Because that's where the Democrats are. So are they doing race or party? That's what the lower court's supposed to disentangle with that claim.
Before we get to audience questions, I've wanted to ask you about President Trump, who's called for culling of voter rolls because he claims that there's been widespread voter fraud, voter ID requirements, including birth certificates and passports for people before they have to vote. Before we get into the individual demands of the president, to what extent does the president have authority over federal elections, versus Congress?
Right. So I mentioned earlier that the Constitution says that Congress can make or alter rules that states use for congressional elections. The president has no role. In fact, back in August, the president the president signed an executive order that purported to do certain things related to elections. Now, an executive order is not a law. It's a directive to the executive branch agencies like DOJ, this is what you should do. Department of Homeland Security, this is what you should do. And so he purported to direct an independent U.S. agency that most people have never heard of called the United States Election Assistance Commission to make that agency change the form that people can use to register to vote in federal elections to require documentary proof of citizenship like a passport or a birth certificate and the like. And just this past week, a federal district court ruled and said, you don't have any authority here. The president has no role to play in how elections are run. It was a very strong statement from a very well-respected federal district court judge in Washington, D.C. It was similar to a ruling she issued earlier when she issued a preliminary injunction. And one of the things that was notable here, the Trump administration keeps running to the Supreme Court, trying to get reversals of these preliminary rulings. They didn't go to the Supreme Court on this one, on the preliminary ruling, probably because they know they have no leg to stand on. So Trump is trying to do all kinds of things, say, don't use mail-in balloting. He says he's going to do stuff about voting machines. We don't know exactly what his plans are, like if he's going to issue another executive order. But as the Constitution goes, he has no role to play other than to faithfully execute the laws. And none of what he's trying to do is about executing the laws. They're about his own views about whether mail-in balloting is rife with fraud or his other concerns about rigged elections.
And so you see during the remaining 3.5 years of his term, these uh, executive orders likely to go nowhere because there's just no appetite to follow up on it.
Well, so some of what he did in the executive order, he can do. For example, part of that executive order, which was not challenged in court, says it directs the Department of Justice to go after states like California that allow ballots that are cast by election day to arrive after election day and be counted. So states have different rules on this. So in Pennsylvania, any mail-in ballot has to arrive by election day, but California has a more lenient standard. And there's an argument that's been made, and it was accepted out in a case out of Mississippi by the Fifth Circuit, that federal law requires that the ballots be arrive by election day. So he's directed Department of Justice to go after states like California and sue them on this. On that separate question on the merits of whether or not ballots that arrive after election day be counted, we should know as soon as Monday if the Supreme Court's going to take that Mississippi case and hear that. And I think it's a pretty decent chance they will. But so he can direct DOJ to do that. I'm more concerned about the kind of extra legal things he can do. So first of all, riling up his base and getting people thinking that anytime Democrats win, it's because of fraud. I mean, Trump claimed before the election that Prop 50 was rigged. Like, he never said how this would be. There's no evidence of any kind of tampering of any kind. But what if he decides to send ICE agents or other federal agents to Milwaukee, to Philadelphia, to places around the country at the time of the midterm elections in a way to create an atmosphere of fear that might deter people from showing up at the polls? That's the sort of thing. It's not directly election authority, but it's the kind of thing that potentially the Supreme Court might give him a green light to do, and it could be affecting voting. And we had this big controversy when Trump said he was going to send election monitors. The DOJ sending election monitors to California. So I sent like literally 2 people to Orange County. Like, they didn't send an army of people, but there were so many stories, there were a lot of breathless stories, and I tried to tell the media to calm down. Some of these things are just meant to be a kind of head fake to make people think that there's going to be problems at the polls and deter them from going. That seems to be part of what he's doing.
And if in fact this was something that the president embarked on around the midterms, you'd be certain to see all kinds of nonprofits as well as state governments urging people to use mail-in ballots if they're afraid to go to a polling location. And again, as we've seen with California, counter President Trump on election matters. Again, all of these sorts of strategies. There are counter punches that organizations and states have that they can make.
Absolutely. And I advise anyone in a state where you can vote early, either in person or by mail, to do that rather than election day, just because you don't know what kind of interruptions there might be. And, if election day passes and you haven't voted, it's too late. But you're right. The idea, though, that we would have to protect voters against the federal government, it's just like we're like living in just a crazy time in American history. I mean, if you think about when federal observers were really used in a positive way, it was during the civil rights era when federal monitors were sent down to Alabama and to other southern states and being asked to register voters because the state and local officials wouldn't register black voters, and made sure that the polling places were free of violence because mobs were keeping black voters away. That was this very salutary role of the federal government. I always thought of the federal government as a great protector of voting rights. And here, the idea that we might have to have, plans, contingency plans to protect the voters from the federal government in order to be able to vote. It's just a sad testament to what's happened to our democracy, that's a serious thing that we have to consider and plan for.
Professor, let's take some of our viewer questions. We have so many that have come in. Jim asks, if Congress were to pass a law that would ban political gerrymandering, would that be subject to SCOTUS review? And is that something that would require a constitutional amendment? I just wants to know the mechanics if Congress had an appetite for that.
So the part of the Constitution that I mentioned that says that Congress has the power to make or alter state rules for congressional elections, that power, it's sometimes called the elections clause in the Constitution, that power the Supreme Court has read very broadly. The court has said the line is really, is this about a voter qualification? Like, for example, disenfranchising felons or not? That's a qualification question. That the Constitution leaves to states. But so long it's about the mechanics. So could Congress mandate vote by mail under this power? Yes. Could Congress ban vote by mail under this power? Yes. They can't say who can vote, but they can talk about the procedures. I think partisan gerrymandering would be seen in the same way. So if Congress did this, I mean, you can never know with the Supreme Court what they're going to say, but if based on what they've said about the election code, including very conservative justices like Justice Scalia, they've seen this power as very broad. And so I think if Congress actually passed it, it would go into effect just like that law that Congress passed back in 1842 that says that we only can use single member districts for electing members of the House. And that itself was meant to stop some of this partisan gerrymandering.
Karen asked, do we know which secretaries of state around the country have sent their voter rolls to the federal government, to the Department of Justice, at the direction of the Trump administration?
So, just to give a little background on this, the Trump administration has been asking states to provide certain information on voter data. Some states have willingly done so. I don't have a list in front of me, but these are all Republican-friendly states. Some states have pushed back and not provide the information. I think there have been a couple of lawsuits trying to challenge the authority. The end game here appears to be to try to do some matching of voter rolls with a citizenship database that is maintained by the Department of Homeland Security for a different purpose. Trump won, like during the first Trump administration, they tried to do stuff like this. And there was much more resistance from even Republican secretaries of state to provide this information. When it happened during Trump one, this was the so-called Pence-Kobach Commission. It was headed by Vice President Pence and now Attorney General of Kansas, Chris Kobach, a noted, election fraud hysteric, I would say. That commission was trying to gather that data, I think, as a pretext to try to get Congress to pass a documentary proof of citizenship law. That's really what I'm worried about more than anything for elections going forward. That idea that you're going to make people show their papers, when you're trying to register people at Costco, people are not showing up with their birth certificate and their marriage certificate if they've changed their name when they get married. It could really disenfranchise a lot of people. We know because Kobach in Kansas tried to do it, and before a federal court put it on hold, 30,000 eligible voters had their registration stopped because they hadn't provided the passport or the stuff. So the House this year passed the so-called SAVE Act, which requires this documentary proof of citizenship. Lucky for us, there are Republicans in the Senate who are opposed to this. And there's the filibuster right now that protects against this law passing because it's already passed the House. It otherwise could pass the Senate. One of the big opponents of this law, Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell believes that if you let the federal government do this now under Republican rule, then Democrats are going to come in and they're going to do a lot more about election reform when they come back into power. So that's what the end game is for all of the requests for these voter rolls.
What about other countries? Do they require typically proof of citizenship, or what are the bars that you have to get over in other countries to vote?
The way most other countries vote is so different than the United States. First of all, most other countries, people have a national identity card. And so already putting aside voting, everyone who's a citizen is given a national identity card. So you don't have to figure out who a citizen is. When you're born, you're basically a records kept and you're able to get your citizenship proven. It's a card you carry around, kind of like a driver's license, but it's like internal. And then there's a national nonpartisan body that administers elections that has access to the rolls of the people who are citizens. In many places, if you're a citizen, you're automatically registered to vote. The government registers you. You don't have, like we have in the United States, this private system of registration or the putting the onus on the voter to go out and register to vote. And then it's run by nonpartisan professionals. For many years, I was a big supporter of trying to move the United States in this direction towards national nonpartisan election administration. I wrote a whole book advocating for this back in 2012 called The Voting Wars. And I've now abandoned that. Not because I think it's a bad idea, but because I think American democracy is so weak right now that if you had a national body, and you had someone like Trump, they could try to manipulate this and then they'd have control over the whole system. So I'm now looking at the fact that we are decentralized and hyper
See that
decentralized
as a
power.
plus.
It's actually a bulwark against the kind of centralized attempt to manipulate election outcomes that we have to think about as a serious concern in 2026 and 2028.
This is a good time, I think, in your book, A Real Right to Vote. You advocate for another way of assuring that a person voting is authentically qualified to vote. And please restate your idea for resolving this issue, because the majority of Americans do say that they support some form of voter identification.
Yeah, the whole idea of identification is not a problem, and I have no problem with voter ID laws in the abstract. But the way it has to happen is that the government has to t bear the onus of making sure that all citizens are able to get. I knew that was going to happen. My automatic light went off. Making sure that all of the documents that people need, whatever people need to prove their citizenship, the government would bear the onus of trying to establish people's citizenship. If we did that, it wouldn't be a problem. And I would require this could be a great place for compromise. Republicans want voter ID, Democrats want easier voter registration. Let's have universal voter registration coupled with voter ID. I think that's a way of getting something that would both secure the integrity of the process and provide access for voters. The problem with state ID laws is which IDs do you allow? So when Texas first came up with its law, a concealed weapons permit was acceptable as a form of ID, but not a student ID from a college. Now, eventually there was litigation against Texas, and Texas modified their law so that if someone didn't have the right document, they could sign an affidavit under penalty of perjury saying who they are. And that's been a kind of compromise way to deal with this. I don't think that these kind of laws about requiring ID to vote are as onerous as laws that say you can't even register unless you prove your citizenship. The way we deal with citizenship now is people have to attest under penalty of perjury that they are a citizen. If you sign that and you're lying, you're not a citizen, you're committing a felony. And so it rarely happens. And oftentimes when people who are non-citizens are registered to vote, it's because they've gone to the DMV, they're dealing with that PIN pad, they think that they're just like signing their name and they're actually signing up to register to vote because the clerk doesn't explain what's going on. So we have very little non-citizen voting in this country. Having a documentary proof of citizenship requirement without having a national ID card is a problem. And putting the onus, it costs money to get a birth certificate, especially if you've come from another state. A passport, I think, costs almost $200 to get. It's not so easy to prove your citizenship, even if you've lived in the same town your entire life.
We have a number of questions from viewers sort of asking you to look into a crystal ball. And I don't know how fair they are, but I'm going to ask a couple of them just to see if you have thoughts. Ruth asking, well, if Democrats were to take back the majority of both houses, I think most analysts think Republicans are fairly safe to keep the Senate. But she says if both houses go Democratic, what are the chances that the Democratic wins would not be certified, that they would not be sworn in and seated?
Yeah, so this is a concern. Now, it's more of a concern in the House than in the Senate. The Senate is what we call a continuing body, because in the Senate, we only elect a third of the Senate every 2 years. Senators serve 6-year terms and they're staggered. So we're electing 33 or 34 every 2 years. And so they have rules for how they handle the admission of senators. In the House, you may remember the House can't do any business until they pick a Speaker of the House, and there's like that interim period. That's when we had the many votes to try to get Kevin McCarthy to be the House member. At that time, there may be disputes about who is eligible to be seated, and if we're as close as we are now, and Republicans have a slight majority, I am concerned. Just like we saw, there's a representative who was just elected in a special election in Arizona. She has not been seated.
Right.
That there could be some delay, or if there's some basis to claim that there was, close election, an election contest, even not fraud, but like a recount, the House has the ability to investigate these things. There's a long history going back to 1985 where there was a very close election, and Democrats essentially reversed the results in an election, and this really infuriated Republicans, and it created kind of this very bad blood and this bad precedent. And this has gone on for many decades. And so it's a concern. But if it's a blowout, if Democrats, it's a wave election and Democrats do very well, then I expect things are going to go quite smoothly. The place where it could be really a problem is if it's very, very narrow Democratic victory. And then, there's a question of, well, who's going to resolve the impasse? We can kind of see right now with the shutdown that resolving impasses in Washington is becoming ever more difficult.
Lori says, Latinos are not a race, they're an ethnicity with tremendous diversity. So, under the Voting Rights Act, under election law generally, how or why would Latinos be considered a racial group?
So, I'm using race as a shorthand. What the statute actually says is race or a protected language minority. In practice, this means African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, and Asian Americans. Those are the groups that have typically been protected. And in order to show a voting rights violation, you have to show a politically cohesive group. So if you have like a group of Vietnamese Americans who tend to vote Republican, which is the case down in parts of Orange County, and nearby, you have large groups of Chinese voters who don't tend to vote Republican. You wouldn't be able to make a Voting Rights Act violation by putting them together. You have to show that the group not only has a similar racial or ethnic background, but also that they vote as a bloc, consistently try to vote to elect candidates of their choice, and the white majority consistently votes to oppose them. This is why this part of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, is kind of self-sunsetting. It'll go out of business on its own accord. Once whites and minority voters are preferring the same set of candidates, and that's true more so in a place like Los Angeles now, you don't see as much racially polarized voting as you used to. You still see a lot of it in the American South, but if you can't make out that as a voting rights plaintiff, if you can't show that there's racially polarized voting, and you can't show there's a cohesive group of minority voters who are large enough to be able to create a district where they could elect candidates of their choice, then you can't make out a Section 2 violation. It's only in those places, and you could think of like Central Valley in California, where Latino farm workers have different interests than white ranchers. Like that's a much more typical kind of pattern that we see where there could potentially be a Voting Rights Act violation.
It was interesting because you mentioned language groups, and of course, the majority of Latinos in America, English is their primary language, not Spanish, of course.
That's right.
Yeah. Monty says, in an ideal political world, you could use AI to design districts, providing equal numbers of residents without fear or favor, make it agnostic. If the AI technology exists, why isn't that something that's part of the conversation?
Well, when you draw district lines, it's not as much of a science as it is a case of making a judgment call. So think about the work of the California Redistricting Commission, the commission that drew the lines that were temporarily thrown out by Prop 50 and are still in place for the state legislature. They considered evidence of who are the communities of interest, whether it's farmers or people who are industrial workers or college students. When they're drawing the district lines, they are taking into account the idea that we want to draw districts so that it represents people who have cohesive interests. So, putting together, say, people with very disparate interests, you may end up with districts where some of the people in the district feel well represented and some feel poorly represented. If you can draw the districts to accomplish certain goals, political goals, that's okay, as long as you're not making partisanship the most important thing. Where we're seeing the use of AI and the use of computers in general is in these Section 2 cases and in these racial gerrymandering cases, where a state will draw a map and they'll say, oh, we had to do it this way for partisan reasons. Well, then you might ask a computer to draw 1,000,000 maps. Can you accomplish the same partisan goal without having this racial problem? And so litigants are actually using the maps to try and show fairness. The other thing that's happening is these commissions take evidence from voters. You can go and testify before these commissions in a lot of places. And people are they're using software that's publicly available. They're making their own maps and they're presenting them. And
We've
so
seen
it's
that.
become much easier. You don't have to be a computer whiz or somebody who's invested lots of money in proprietary data to be able to do that. So I do think that technology can help here, but I also think there's a question of a judgment call. You still have to, even if AI draws a bunch of maps, you still have to, a human still has to decide which is best, or what are the criteria we're going to use to decide which is best. You can't just, you don't want just a random map that would just put people who
Well,
don't want to be together in the same district.
yeah, I mean, well, and you'd have to determine what's the hierarchy of criteria that you're feeding into the AI, of course, and that would be a battle. Rod says much of the focus yesterday, looking at the Democratic wins, was the two governorships. But in Mississippi, Democrats flipped Senate seats to break the Republican supermajority in the Mississippi state legislature. How significant do you see that in a Republican-dominated state?
Well, we did see this now. I think this was the sixth time that Democrats in the last few years have broken Republican supermajorities. And that matters, for example, when you have not in Mississippi, but in a place like Kansas or North Carolina, where you may have a Democratic governor, Republican legislature. So if they've got a supermajority, they might be able to get over a veto, get a two-thirds majority. And so there are certain kinds of laws in each state that can only be passed, like urgency legislation in California requires a larger vote, something that has to go into effect immediately. So these supermajority rules can matter, but I think it also matters psychologically. The idea that Democrats are making gains in a hard red state like Mississippi sends a signal to Republicans that, things are not as safe as they used to be. Now, whether that means that Republicans are more going to be apt to compromise or they're going to want to dig their heels in, I don't know. But it certainly is, it gets noticed by people in these states. And, remember, these legislatures are also doing things like drawing state legislative maps. And there, the self-interest of the legislators is most involved. And so if Republicans lose their supermajority, when they're drawing those state legislative maps, they may be more likely to take into account what their Democratic incumbent fellow legislators want, because going to want to need them for when they come up with other things where they're going to actually need their votes to get something done.
We're getting close to the end here, but John in Sydney, Australia asks, for the upcoming midterm elections, what sorts of voter restrictions do you anticipate? We touched on this a little bit, but what do you think are the most likely ones to be implemented ahead of next year's elections?
So the one I mentioned before, this documentary proof of citizenship laws, these haven't passed, it hasn't passed on the federal level, but states have passed it. And so in Arizona today, if you go to register to vote in Arizona and you do not provide your identification, you will not be registered to vote, period. If you use the federal form, the one that we talked about earlier, you'll be registered to vote only for federal elections. You will not be allowed to vote for state elections. So that's people, real people being disenfranchised, far more people than under a voter ID law. These are people who are eligible voters but didn't provide the right paperwork, and they're being disenfranchised. And I think we're going to see those kind of laws around the country. I think that's like the number one thing on my list. There are also some attempts to try to make the use of the initiative process harder, because in some places you have like a Republican legislator and voters want to get redistricting reform through or some other kind of election reform. This happened in Michigan, and Michigan voters were able to pass some changes in laws, and then the legislature changed from Republican to Democrat. So there, in other states, there have been ways trying to clamp down, make direct democracy harder, which always hurts the minority in whatever state you're in, whoever's in the minority party. It's the same reason why Republicans wanted to pass redistricting reform in California. It's another way through. So I'm looking at those. And then really the other thing I'm concerned about are not the state laws, but they're what the role of the federal government is going to be. I don't think we're going to see before 2026 significant changes in state laws aside from documentary proof of citizenship, but I am concerned that the drumbeat of fraud is only going to get louder. We might potentially see the Department of Justice trying to bring some prosecutions. Trump said about Proposition 50 that there was criminal activity, which is a very serious statement to make, no proof of that. So I'm really worried more about what the Trump administration is going to do than major changes in states over the next couple of months.
Multiple viewers have asked about the prospects of the challenge to Proposition 50 from California Republicans reaching to the Supreme Court. Do you think that the court will have an appetite to take up any aspect of it?
Well, these cases actually they come from a three-judge court with direct appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has to rule on them. It's not like most cases that get to the Supreme Court, which come up on what's called a cert petition, where it's completely discretionary. The court has to rule. So that's why the court rules in so many of these racial gerrymandering and voting rights cases, redistricting cases. So I think if a lower court rules and says no preliminary injunction for Republicans, there's going to be an appeal to try and get some injunction from the U.S. Supreme Court. That's what I expect. I expect this case over Prop 50 to get to the Supreme Court one way or the other in the next few months, even if the three-judge court refuses to act.
And the Supreme Court, in a case like that, does it have to give any reasoning behind the decision that it renders?
Not when it's coming up on a temporary basis. They could just put a ruling on hold or just issue an order without explanation. We've seen a lot of that in these emergency cases. Again, I just to say, as the big picture is, I'm very skeptical that a challenge to Proposition 50, the maps created by Proposition 50, would successfully stop California from doing what's putting the new maps in place for 2026 at the least.
Linda in Oakland, California, final audience question we can take, asking how you think the Supreme Court is likely going to rule on the Voting Rights Act.
That's a huge question. I'm not sure. At the oral argument in that Louisiana case, I heard a number of justices expressing skepticism about how the Voting Rights Act Section 2 has been interpreted. I think the most likely thing that happens in that case is that the court doesn't strike down the Voting Rights Act, but waters it down significantly so that it no longer protects minority voters the way it has in the past.
Let's conclude, Professor, with your thoughts looking forward. So often our viewers want to know, well, what's my role here? What can I do to try and assure democracy and the integrity of the process going forward? What advice do you have or closing thoughts for us to keep in mind?
Yeah, so I think, there are a lot of challenges, but the message is one of resilience. Because we have such a decentralized system, that means that there are many opportunities for people to serve as a poll worker, serve as an election observer, work with election protection, register people to vote. There's just our decentralized system gives many places to enter into the process. And because our elections are administered on the local level, it's really important for civic leaders, religious leaders, business leaders to get behind our election administrators, make sure they don't buckle under any pressure from Trump or anyone else, and they assure that we continue to have free elections and fair vote counts in a transparent way so we can all be confident that the results that are announced actually reflect the will of the people.
Professor, thank you so much for being with us again on America Crossroads, particularly a day where you've been talking with media nonstop in the wake of yesterday's elections. Great to have a full hour to talk with you about these important issues. Thank you very much.
Larry, you always have the best questions, so it's a pleasure to have had this conversation with you.
Thank you for doing this. Also, I want to thank you for watching our program this evening and remind you to please support these great programs. I'm not aware of any other program that each week brings you the caliber of guests, the kind of analysis, and not just on political issues, but a wide range of important matters of public concern. Your support of this nonprofit organization is huge. So please consider making a tax-deductible contribution right now at the website JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. That's JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. We thank you very much. And I'm going to be back with you next week, along with Janice, Mel, and Zev, as I'll be talking with former CIA officer Stephen Cash. He heads the nonprofit advocacy group, The Steady State. It's made up of former U.S. intelligence veterans who were opposed to President Trump's actions. We'll be with you again. That's 5 o'clock Pacific time next Wednesday, right here for America at a Crossroads. Make sure you make your reservation and sign up to join us with the link. Thank you so much. Have a terrific rest of your evening.